Over
Okay,
to you, Mark.
great. Thank you very much, Debbie, and thank you everyone for joining. Especially given that as we've said, there's other things happening at the moment, which will hopefully go well. Let's see. So yeah, good evening. I have got a slide just to introduce myself, so I will go straight on to this one. So I realise that many of you will not know anything about me. So yeah, quite helpful. A little bit of background, just to say that. Essentially, I'm working at the moment at Northumbria University as an assistant professor now. But my background is sort of very much in ecology and most recently urban ecology. And that sort of culminated in a PhD that I did at Leeds back in sort of toward finishing in 2012, should we say. But I do actually have some real world experience as well. So I worked for a while voluntary position at the Conservation Volunteers, or BTCV as it was then. Also worked for a short while at the Wildlife Trust in Teesside as a water voles project officer, and that's what that top right photo is showing there. Believe it or not, that is supposed to be me dressed up as a water. Well, it is me. It's supposed to be a water vole, but I know that's not very apparent. And then I also worked for about 4 or 5 years as an ecological consultant, which is when I first really engaged with SAIE. And I sort of took on sort of associate membership, which I have retained throughout my sort of academic career. And yeah, of late, I've also been a member of the academia special interest group, and hence the invitation to talk tonight. So that's a little bit of background about me. My work in urban ecology has largely been on urban pollinators, but I've also done some work on birds and soils and other things as well. So I'm quite a generalist. Okay, so what we're going to talk about tonight. Well, as you know, we're going to be looking at wildlife gardening, specifically looking at some of the research around wildlife gardening that I've been involved with, and also others. So I'm not going to only talk about my own work, but also other people's as well. Start with a bit of background, just talking about the value that gardens have as sort of wildlife habitat, and then I'm going to go into talk about 5 sort of myths around wildlife gardening, some of which have some truth in them and others less so. And at the same time, I'm going to be talking about some of the opportunities that emerge for sort of biodiversity conservation from a wildlife gardening perspective. And then I'm going to finish off briefly with some sort of research gaps and recommendations. I should sort of say as a disclaimer that I'm not an expert wildlife gardener. I'm very much coming at this from a sort of a research point of view, and often from the theory and not the practice. So I'm not pretending to have like a wealth of experience of wildlife gardening, but as I say, I do have some research background, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So, first of all, for context, then, probably many of you will know this already, but gardens, residential landscapes are major land covers. So, work in the UK has shown that gardens cover a quarter or even up to a third of cities on average, and often up to half of the total green space. And if we want to think about it in sort of the sheer quantity of habitat, over 700,000 hectares of outdoor space within Great Britain. And the majority of this is also vegetated. So over 60% of the area is also sort of provides potential for biodiversity conservation. And there was some work by Zoe Davies, who sort of tried to quantify the exact amount of habitat sort of I think this is at the UK scale. So for example, in gardens across the UK, there's nearly 30 million trees, over 4.5 million nest boxes, 3.5 million ponds, for example. Nearly half of us feed the birds as well. So bird feeding is probably the main way actually in which we interact with wildlife on a daily basis. And of course, gardens in general are really vital places for allowing people to experience nature in their everyday lives. And that's part of what makes them so important. And if we want to think about it from a sort of an economic point of view, gardening itself is also a huge industry. So an estimate there in sort of 2021 that people spent over £7 billion in the UK on sort of plants, flowers, and gardening equipment more widely. So there's an awful lot of sort of economic interest in gardening as well. So that's a little bit of background on the context. But in terms of thinking about gardens as wildlife habitat, we've actually seen sort of a paradigm shift really in probably the last maybe 10, 20 years. So there's a really nice quote here from Charles Elton, who is one of the sort of the godfathers, if you like, of ecology in the UK. Didn't get many things wrong, but here's one thing that I think he did get wrong. Okay, this is what he said. He talked about buildings and gardens being in the direction of biological deserts. Saying that essentially that they're dominated only by exotic plant species and have so few animals attached to them. So he dismissed gardens essentially as habitat for wildlife. If we then sort of fast forward maybe another sort of 50 years or so, we have a remarkable example of actually how wrong Charles Elton was about this. And this is the wonderful work of Jennifer Owen, who hopefully many of you have come across already. And she spent over 30 years documenting huge amounts of biodiversity in her single garden in Leicester. It was a fairly typical garden. It was big, so it was over 700 square meters, but it was sort of suburban. It wasn't especially big, and she didn't manage it in a way that was solely sort of with biodiversity in mind. She used it as a productive space, a recreational space as well. But in this garden, which was, as you can see there, a tiny fraction of the area of Britain, obviously a single garden, she recorded over 2,600 species. So it says there's 20 species new to Britain, 6 of which sort of new to science. And it turns out that her garden is one of the most biodiverse places on the whole planet, of course, because of the amazing dedication she spent to documenting that diversity over so long. So what we have seen over time is an increase in an increased realization that gardens are important for biodiversity. And this figure comes from work from Des Delahaye, who's another one of our colleagues on the Academia Special Interest Group. And this is just simply showing the number of published studies over time that have been focused on biodiversity in gardens. And we see very little really up until about the year 2000. And then we see this steady increase in papers that are being published. And of course, we are seeing more generally more research papers being published in general, but I think this is an underlying trend that people have started to realize the value that gardens do have, and sort of urban ecology in general has also taken off over this period as we realize that cities are important places for biodiversity conservation. So thinking about how people have studied or approached studying garden biodiversity, you can sort of see 3 main different approaches. Okay, so the first one is the sort of the example I've just been talking about from Jennifer Owen. There's a few other examples as well, sort of long-term studies into a single garden. And these are really, really useful for seeing trends over time. But of course, how much can you really infer from a single garden? So limited in that sense. We then have started to see a number of sort of shorter term studies that are looking at multiple gardens. And a well-known example of this was the biodiversity in urban gardens in Sheffield study. And that started off by studying around about 50, 60 gardens in Sheffield, and then it extended to 5 further cities as well. So that was really the first time that there was any sort of major research into multiple gardens, and that work happened sort of in the early 2000s and onwards. And then finally, we're also now seeing lots of long-term studies that are also focusing on multiple gardens, and often this is happening through citizen science, and this allows us to start to sort of see national trends in various different taxa. So there's an example here that comes from the BTO Garden Bird Watch, which is showing how birds are using feeders and how that's changed from sort of the 1970s into the 2010s. You can see it in red here that many species have increased in gardens, but there have also been some notable species that have decreased, such as song thrush, house sparrow, starling. So we can see that how valuable gardens can be for understanding these sort of long-term trends in biodiversity. So that's an example from birds. That was Kate Plummer. Here's another piece of work by Kate Plummer, and this was with butterflies. So the BTO have now branched out into butterflies as well. And you can see here it's very, very small, but again, looking at how butterfly populations have changed in gardens over time. And again, many species actually showing increases. And it seems that butterflies are doing particularly well in gardens relative to the wider landscape. So really, really valuable data coming out of gardens to help us understand national trends. Right, so that's a little bit of sort of background, if you like, on the value of gardens and the research that has been done. What I'm going to move towards now is thinking about some of these wildlife gardening myths. And I want to say here that a lot of these ideas draw heavily on the ideas of Steve Head and Ken Thompson. So Steve Head, many of you may know him as the founder of the Wildlife Gardening Forum, and I should have mentioned this at the start that I sit on the committee, steering committee of that charity. It's a very sort of small charity, but it's really focused on sort of advocating the value of gardens for wildlife, and also thinking about sort of showcasing the research opportunities. So Steve is the founder patron of the Wildlife Gardening Forum, and also Ken Thompson, who's retired now, was at University of Sheffield. He has also done a lot of work through the Wildlife Gardening Forum, and you may well have read his excellent book, No Nettles Required, and he's got others as well that talk about the work that's done in Sheffield. So a lot of credit here should be given to Steve and Ken for some of these things that I'm going to be talking about. Okay, so the first myth is this idea that, gardens, only wildlife gardens are good for wildlife. Okay, so we actually see from the work in Sheffield and elsewhere that randomly selected gardens, sort of ordinary gardens, are actually very, very rich in biodiversity, especially plants. As you probably can imagine, a lot of this is cultivated species, but here's a figure to sort of underline this. So what you can see here are species easy for me to say, species accumulation curves, okay, from 5 gardens, or actually it's just showing two gardens in 2 cities, which are Leicester and Belfast, and comparing those gardens to other notable habitats, including things like limestone grassland, brownfield grassland, acidic grassland. And the key thing to note here is that actually gardens in Leicester, which were the most diverse, and Belfast, which were the least diverse, still actually showed sort of greater species diversity than these other types of habitats, okay? And you can also see the species accumulation curves not plateauing out, especially for Leicester, which showed that actually if more gardens were studied, you'd get an even greater diversity of species, or if more quadrats were put down in those gardens. So we know that gardens are tremendously diverse in terms of plants. And of course, many of those are exotic, and we'll come on to talk about that. But just simply in terms of biodiversity, typical ordinary gardens are very, very valuable. And yeah, there's many reasons. I'm not going to go into detail about all of these, but many reasons why that's the case. As I mentioned, obviously this idea of contrived plant diversity. We keep adding new plants to gardens. There's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of disturbance, and that means that you don't get dominance of a few species that you might do in a more natural ecosystem. Gardens also like to create structural heterogeneity in their gardens. So typically that means you get a range of different plant forms, but also habitat for other groups of wildlife as well. We'll come on to this, but also lawns themselves, which often are the dominant habitat type within a garden, are actually surprisingly diverse themselves. And we've mentioned this idea of the high biomass of vegetation and productivity supports insects and mammals and other higher trophic levels. Okay, so there's many reasons why gardening itself, gardening per se, is very, very good for wildlife. And of course, there are things that we can do to make our gardens even more valuable, and we'll explore some of those. But it's important to note that gardening in itself is very, 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 very good for wildlife often. Okay, so myth 2, size matters. Okay, only big gardens are of value for wildlife. Now, we know that there's the well-established rule in ecology, the species-area relationship, and more often than not, larger habitats, of course, do contain more species, but things are often quite different within gardens, and we know that for many groups of wildlife, the area of the garden is not actually related to the diversity of species within that garden. And I should mention again here that really useful systematic review by Des Delahaye that talks a lot about this in detail. So do have a look at that if you want to know the up-to-date research on this. We do know that large gardens do typically contain more plants. They also contain sort of more microhabitats, more wildlife-friendly features. But that often doesn't translate into biodiversity of other groups. So, for example, in Sheffield, the area of the gardens actually didn't predict the species richness for any group of invertebrates. So the important thing here is that you can make a big difference for biodiversity, whatever the size of your garden. Okay, there's a very very important reason, essentially, why garden area often is not a good predictor of biodiversity, and that is because individual gardens should not be taken in isolation. Okay, gardens form part of the larger landscape. Okay, so they're sort of that we can see them as interconnected habitat patches, and we need to think about them at multiple scales. So this is actually some work that I did as part of my PhD at Leeds, and it was simply just trying to enforce the point that many of the wildlife groups, many of the insects, birds, mammals, obviously, that use gardens, they require habitat at much larger scales than the individual garden. Okay, so if we're going to really try and understand how important gardens are for biodiversity, we have to take a landscape ecology perspective and think about them as part of a wide landscape. And we'll come on to talk about this, but that's why it is really important to try and sort of think about things that happen at the neighborhood scale and the cumulative activities of multiple householders that can scale up to really have sort of large scale impacts on biodiversity. And of course, how gardens relate to other green space within the city is really important as well. And in that sort of right-hand panel, gardens are sort of the light colour, but you can also see other green spaces, woodlands, and how gardens link as well the city with the wider countryside is really important to try and understand as well. So we need to think about gardens from this landscape ecology perspective at multiple scales. So this figure is just trying to illustrate that using sort of birds as an example. So in the top panel, for example, you can see that there's sort of individual habitat features within a garden, such as a tree, will be important in terms of providing habitat for perhaps a bird to put their nest. There are also sort of human decision making going on at that scale as well, like the decision to irrigate your lawn or to have a cat, which can also affect birds and of course other wildlife as well. And then as you move down sort of to a larger scale, you can see how sort of the configuration of groups of gardens, the various sort of the cumulative activity of individual householders starts to impact. You can see some people chatting over the garden fence there. Okay, so you're getting birds from multiple gardens interacting with each other. You've got cats roaming across multiple gardens and so on. And ultimately, how gardens are linking up with other habitats at the city scale, and it's going to be really, really important in terms of sort of predicting that sort of wider city scale biodiversity. So essentially, you've got multiple factors driving biodiversity of birds and other groups as well. So ecological factors, social factors happening at multiple scales. Okay. And this is another example from my PhD, just to try and illustrate the fact that actually these individual actions do scale up to have an impact on bird populations and bird diversity. So what you've got in this figure here, so I did some work in 6 different areas of Leeds, and those within each of these sort of 6 wards of Leeds, I studied 3 neighbourhoods. So there was 18 sort of study sites in total. And what you can see here is that the mean wildlife resources index is the average amount of habitat available for birds within gardens is actually related to the diversity of birds within those landscapes. So you get this sort of positive relationship between the amount of habitat available and the diversity. So this is thinking about sort of, gardens, the habitat available across whole groups of gardens, whole neighbourhoods. Okay, so hopefully that's clear using an example from birds. There's another example here for moths as well. So this is the work of Emily Ellis, who studied moths in Ireland. And she found a similar thing, that actually moths are not influenced by the size of the garden or the habitat quality of that garden, but actually by sort of broader scale landscape factors. So further evidence that we need to think about gardens at this sort of network of patch scale rather than individual units. Okay, so size doesn't necessarily matter. Right, myth 3, maybe quite a controversial one when we're speaking to ecologists, but we don't always only have to plant native species. Okay, so we know that gardens have many roles, and we may all be very passionate from the biodiversity point of view, but we also have to be understanding that people need to use their gardens for different things. Often recreation is very important, the aesthetic value. People are getting an awful lot of mental health benefits from gardening as well. So supporting wildlife is only one reason why people might have a garden. And non-native species are certainly of value to garden wildlife as well. As an example from the Sheffield work, it showed that actually the number of native plant species within a garden was often a poor predictor of the number of animal species. Now, there are also contrary examples here, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't plant native species, and if you have a choice, definitely go native, but I'm just trying to say we don't need to be too strong about it and too militant about it. I've got another example from pollinators here. So we know that gardens are especially important for pollinators. So I'm going to present some evidence around that now. So this was a project that I worked on a few years ago now, a collaboration between 4 universities, so Edinburgh, Leeds, Bristol, and Reading. And one part of this study, we're interested in which parts of cities, which urban habitats were most important for supporting biodiversity. So basically identifying hotspots for pollinators within cities. So we studied 4 cities across the UK. And these are the results. Okay, so we've got 9 different land uses that we studied, and you can see the land uses across the bottom of this figure here. The different colours represent the different cities. The key thing to take away is this is the mean abundance of pollinators in total. Sorry, of bees. This is just bees. The mean abundance of bees was significantly higher in allotments and gardens than it was in pretty much all of the other habitats. Okay, so allotments and gardens, tremendously important for supporting bees within cities. And gardens, because they form such a large area within cities, as we've talked about already, actually are by far and away the most valuable habitat for pollinators within our towns and cities. So what we found was at the city scale, gardens support at least 54 and up to 83% of all pollinators across our 4 cities. Okay, so allotments are fantastic, but there's very, very few of them. So their impact cumulatively is limited. Gardens, on the other hand, tremendously important, and of course they could be even better. And similarly, other green spaces within cities, such as parks and school grounds or things like that, often offer very little, and we can think about how better to how we can improve that management as well. And certainly there are lots of things happening in this space now in terms of no mow May and other initiatives like that. But yeah, gardens currently by far and away the most important habitat for our pollinators in cities. And again, remember, this is just typical ordinary gardens. Okay. And since we did this work, there's been some follow-up work that trying to understand what it is exactly that makes gardens so important, and specifically trying to understand the nectar resource provided by gardens and other habitats. So this is some work by Nick Chu, who did his PhD at Bristol in collaboration with the RHS. And what Nick found was that gardens actually provide around about 85% of nectar within the city, and it's actually non-native plants that are the key source of nectar. We know that pollinators, bees, they need nectar, but of course they also need pollen, and there's further work starting to look into pollen as well. But certainly nectar is a key resource, and gardens are really, really important in providing that, especially non-native species. Further evidence for the value of non-natives comes from an experiment called Plants for Bugs at RHS Wisley. This is a really cool experiment. They essentially set up sort of 3 different experimental treatments. They had native species, near native species, which I think were species within the same genus that weren't actually native, and then exotics, so from a different continent. And they essentially looked at how pollinators and other invertebrate groups as well use these different plots. And what they found was actually that natives and near natives were important, but actually it was really important as well that exotics were provided, so that they, especially in terms of extending the flowering season. Our native plants don't tend to have a particularly long flowering season. So yeah, certainly again, we shouldn't exclude this idea of planting exotics. And of course, there are exceptions to this. Things like ivy are tremendously important late in the season. But yeah, exotics are undeniably really important for pollinators in our cities. Okay, so myth 4, checking the time, plenty of time. So myth 4, lawns are poor for wildlife and we should replace them with flowering meadows. Now, I'm not, again, here going to advocate that lawns are perfect wildlife habitat. There's some work here, as it's mentioned here in the slide, by Watson and others that showed that actually, on average, plant animal diversity is reduced in intensively managed lawns. But equally, work in Sheffield and the Bugs Project showed that just 52 garden lawns in Sheffield supported 159 plant species. So, you know, garden lawns can be very, very important habitats in their own right, especially if we can think about managing them in a little bit more of a sympathetic manner. So we don't need to convert all of our lawns to flowering meadows. We realise that lawns are a really important recreational habitat. Certainly my kids would not be happy if I said to them, like, you can't have your football pitch anymore, we're just gonna have a meadow instead. But allowing some long grass and things like that at the side is really, really important. We'll come on to talk about that. But yeah, and the other thing, of course, is that there are groups of wildlife that do use short lawns, such as mining bees. You would have seen the sort of the small spoil from some of the early mining bees in your lawn, I'm sure. Things like thrushes as well. Really do find short lawn useful habitat. So yeah, we don't need to get rid of all lawns. This is an experiment by Susanna Lerman and others. This is a US-based experiment, but we actually have very little experimental work coming from gardens, especially around wildlife gardening. So this is actually a key gap that I'm going to highlight later. But this experiment was really cool because what Susanna Lerman was able to do was actually manipulate the mowing regimes of, I think, around sort of 15 or 20 gardens. I can't remember exactly how many. This is in the eastern US. And she was actually able to do this because she had a team of people who volunteered to cut the grass for the householders. So maybe that's a lesson for us that we could offer sort of mowing as an incentive to help people take part in these sort of studies. Anyway, the key thing, what they found was that it was actually intermediate levels of mowing, so once every 2 weeks or so, was actually supported the highest abundance of bees. And you can have a look at that paper for some of the sort of underlying rationale behind that. But essentially, was the idea that it allows the lawn to flower, but then it also still relatively short, so the bees are still able to perceive the flowers and they don't get crowded out by long grass. That was sort of one of the hypotheses that they were considering. So again, we can have our lawn, maybe we can relax the mowing a little bit, but we don't have to be too extreme with that. And this is a figure from a recent paper that I've worked on with Susanna Lerman, that, it starts to just give us some ideas for how we might start to transform our lawn management to increase biodiversity. So for sure, we don't want to be advocating this traditional lawn that's mown every week or more than once a week, that is chemically fertilized and irrigated and so on. But small changes that we can make soon start to scale up to have cumulative impacts. So just reducing mowing part of the lawn down to once a fortnight, once a few, leaving patches that at the edges to be even longer, potentially supplementing them with other species or so on, can certainly start to scale up, as I'm saying. So there's some ideas there. Okay, so the final myth is this idea that wildlife gardens are untidy and are sort of not aesthetically appealing. What I want to talk about here is some work by Kevin Gaston and others, that what they did, this is again in Sheffield, they were sort of experimentally testing methods for increasing garden biodiversity. So amongst other things, they tried adding nettle patches to gardens. They also tested things like bumblebee nest boxes, adding ponds and things like that. And the take-home message, and this is Ken Thompson's book here, and that really does sort of summarize this work in a lovely, eloquent way, is that there's no nettles required. Okay, actually adding a patch of nettles within a single garden didn't have any meaningful impact on biodiversity. That's not to say that if a number of people did allow nettles, that soon there would be a cumulative impact, but there's plenty of nettles in the wider landscape. So we shouldn't compel gardeners to have nettles if they don't want them. And again, this is good news for my kids when they're trying to retrieve the ball from the hedge. Okay, so we don't need to have nettles. It doesn't necessarily make any difference at a small scale. But if you can add a pond, that's the best thing that you can do for wildlife. So if you haven't got a pond in your garden, do add one. And here's some very recent research which comes out of butterfly conservation again. This is Hordley and Fox. And what this is again using citizen science data, and we can start to see again the value of getting people signed up to this and how valuable gardens can be. But what they were showing here was that the presence and area of long grass within gardens is positively related to butterfly abundance and richness, but the effect size is relatively small. And you can see the figures there, if you can make it out, that the top panel, you can see the total abundance of on the left and richness on the right of butterflies, where you have the absence or presence of long grass, so slightly higher where there's the presence of grass. And here you can see on the bottom panel, you can see the relationship between the area of grass and the abundance and richness. So some effect is apparent, but it's small. Okay, so again, if you can allow tolerate some areas of long grass at the edge of your garden, then fantastic, that's great. But again, we shouldn't be compelling gardeners to do this. And I think, a really important point to make, and I'll come on to make this, is that without doubt, I know I'm sort of contradicting myself a little bit here, but there are social norms that are in place for tidy gardens, and that is without doubt detrimental for biodiversity. So you've probably all had this if you're trying to manage your garden in a wildlife friendly way, and maybe your neighbour disagrees with that, and they drop some friendly or not so friendly hints about when did you last cut your hedge, or I've certainly had this, or cut your lawn. And I've actually got some evidence around this from my PhD as well. So part of my PhD was looking at some of the social drivers of wildlife gardening. I interviewed around about, well, I had a large questionnaire of sort of over 500 people, and some interviews in a smaller subset of that. We actually found that the vast majority of householders did report feeling this pressure, that there are neighbourhood standards they need to maintain through their gardening. This is particularly true in some of the more affluent neighbourhoods of Leeds. So examples there of cutting the hedge back, for example. So we talk about in this 2013 paper is that social norms can be a barrier to the uptake of wildlife-friendly gardening, but I think it's also important to say that they can also be an opportunity. So we also found that you get sort of neighbourhood mimicry in place for positive actions. So an example, we found that when one person put in a pond, that actually encouraged their neighbour to put in a pond, and another neighbour, and so on. So you get this sort of social diffusion of wildlife-friendly gardening practices, and similarly with bird feeding on other activities as well. So in the same way that we might feel social pressure to cut the grass every week, you can also have similar diffusion of wildlife-friendly practices as well. And it's thinking about how we can incentivize this, which is really, really important. And yeah, some follow-on work from this was some work that I did in Leeds, looking at how bee species richness and abundance differed between two sort of different parts of the city. So if anyone knows Leeds, they'll know that Roundhay is a sort of very affluent, wealthy suburb on the edge of the city, and Armley is a more deprived area close to the city centre. And we were trying to understand how did bees sort of richness and abundance vary between those neighbourhoods, but also what some of the social practices were in those neighbourhoods as well. What we actually found, which was quite surprising, was that there was a strong effect of socioeconomic status. So actually, essentially, as it says here, the sort of less affluent neighbourhoods turned out to be better for bees, and this is because essentially the bees were able to benefit not just from sort of potentially floral resources within these sort of more deprived neighbourhoods, potentially sort of through more native weedy plants, but I think also through nesting opportunities. So having areas of the garden that do allow that sort of slightly more undisturbed habitats. So I think, yeah, I am in some extent here contradicting myself, because I'm saying that we do need to have some of these sort of wild areas within our gardens, but equally, it's a more nuanced picture than that, and we have to realise that that not everyone is going to be sort of hardcore militant wildlife gardens. That's absolutely fine, but where we can tolerate it, we should. So yeah, the take-home message really from this part of the PhD was that we need to be trying to overcome these social norms to try and harness gardens for conservation. So if we can try and capture and facilitate this neighbourhood mimicry for the wildlife friendly practices, then that's going to start to scale up and have large scale impacts. Right, I'm nearly finished now, you'll be pleased to hear. I just wanted to sort of really sort of finish by highlighting the fact that it's not just biodiversity as well, which is really important within gardens, but there's also a whole wide range of other ecosystem services that gardens provide. And you can see some examples there: carbon capture, flood mitigation, aesthetic value, urban cooling, and so on. So the evidence is starting to build around the ecosystem services that are provided by gardens as well. And I think another really important aspect of gardening that I sort of mentioned earlier on was this idea of how important they can be for our health and well-being. I think especially during COVID, people realised that how fundamental these sort of private green spaces are, and especially I actually spent COVID in a rented accommodation. We were between houses, we didn't have a garden, and I personally and my children really felt the absence of a garden in that time. And particularly, actually, there is important evidence that biodiversity in gardens itself is actually related to our health and well-being, especially mental health. So yeah, gardens are important for so many reasons. Okay, so just to finish before I conclude, I've talked a lot about, I guess, some of the things that we should think about, or some of these myths, but I want to be absolutely clear on there's a few things that we definitely should not be doing in our garden. And these could all be separate talks in their own right. So forgive me for not presenting too much evidence around this, but first of all, pesticides, chemicals. This shamefully actually comes from my own grandmother's garden, God rest her soul. Even though I was doing a PhD on wildlife gardening that she was incredibly proud of, and she read about it in her RHS magazine, I still could not convince her to stop using pesticides in her garden. But yeah, the evidence obviously is out there now that these are very, very detrimental to biodiversity. So let's avoid pesticides. This one's a little bit more controversial, I imagine, but cats have huge impacts on biodiversity within residential ecosystems. I think research sort of says that there's over 100 cats per kilometre square. So yeah, thinking about ways of reducing the impact of cats is really important as well. So yeah, if you can keep your cat indoors, then do that, for example. Certainly put a bell on it. Try not to light up your garden like Blackpool illuminations. There's a lot of work coming out now that's sort of talking about the impact of light pollution on biodiversity. So things like obviously nocturnal animals, moths, bats, so on, do get negatively impacted by light pollution. So avoid that if you can. And then finally, artificial grass. So this unfortunately is increasing within cities. So it's interesting, at the same time as we are seeing sort of social movement towards things like no mow May, we're also seeing on the other extreme uptake of things like artificial grass within gardens. So I've actually got a PhD at Northumbria, just started recently to start trying to quantify the impact of artificial grass. So watch this space for research on that. And I'm going to finish now by just talking about some sort of final conclusions, recommendations, if you like. So I think the first thing to say is that we need more experiments around wildlife gardening. So Des's recent review showed that only 4% of the studies on garden biodiversity captured had an experimental angle, and we can't really get at the mechanisms that are driving biodiversity without experimental approaches. So more of those are needed. Just want to reiterate this point that small changes in your garden management, you don't need to convert your whole garden into a meadow. Small changes can start to scale up to have cumulative impacts. I think it's really important to understand some of the social factors as well. It's all about sort of the messaging. It's about our hearts and minds and trying to understand the decision making that people are making. The decisions that people are making is really important if we're going to sort of maximize the value of gardens for conservation. Some simple messages around retaining gardens. Gardens are often getting lost where you've got extensions being built or new houses even being put on gardens. We know that new developments have much smaller gardens than they used to, often very, very limited amount of habitat. So I know there was a little bit of work around this, but something I'd be really interested in doing in general is to work with housing developers to think about how we can maximize biodiversity within new gardens. And authors now have also talked about ways of using policy tools to try and incentivize householders sort of top down, whether it's some sort of financial incentives, tax breaks, regulation. So that's really important to think about what we can do from a top down point of view. But we also need to consider bottom up ways of engaging people through community initiatives, things like the Cats Indoors campaign. This is from the US. Things like certification schemes, which enable people to sort of be proud of what they're doing for wildlife in the same way that they might be proud for their sort of short lawn that they've mown every week for 30 years or whatever it might be. So that's the key points that I wanted to make. Thank you very much for listening. Feel free to follow up. There's my email address there if you've got any questions. Still on Twitter as well, despite the downfall that we've seen in that. And just before we go to questions, I've also was asked to share this video from the British Beekeepers Association around the Asian hornet. So I'll play this and then we can hopefully have time for some questions. I realise I've talked a lot. So let's see if this works.
We need your help. Yellow-legged Asian hornets are invading the UK after spreading through Europe. A single nest can hold thousands of hungry hornets that eat bees, butterflies and other insects. If you accidentally disturb a nest, they become aggressive and will attack. Trust me, you don't want to be stung. If we do nothing, they're going to be impossible to control. They will devastate our local pollinators. We are determined to avoid this, so every year the aim is to remove all the nests, but it's difficult and costly work. This spring, selective traps will be put out to catch the queen hornets when they come out of hibernation or fly here. Every queen caught means one less nest to deal with in the summer. If you come across a trap, please don't touch. They're being looked after by volunteers. This hornet situation is man-made. We need you to join the fight to protect our pollinators and agriculture. Please download the Asian Hornet Watch app to report sightings and help with identification. See it, snap it, app it.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I haven't left too much time for questions, but hopefully enough time for some not too tricky ones.
We don't have any questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone has got any questions they'd like to ask.
I've got a question. So, Mark, fascinating talk. Really enjoyed that. I was interested when you mentioned on one of your last slides about financial incentives for homeowners to try to improve biodiversity in gardens. What kind of schemes? How would that manifest itself, do you think?
Yeah, it's easier said, isn't it? Maybe a bit harder to happen in practice, but there are examples of things that have happened in other places around the world. So I guess it's similar. People get incentives for putting in heat pumps now, solar panels, whatever it might be. So similar things in terms of maybe, I don't know, if you compost at home rather than sending your waste off-site. Water use, that's definitely a one I think that we're going to be looking at more and more of within a changing climate. It's the challenges, of course, is how to sort of try and implement and enforce these sort of things is a challenge. And others have thought about this more than I have. Certainly worth having a look at Ross Cameron's recent paper that sort of starts talking about this. So I can share that if people are interested. But I think we need a combination of top down and bottom up, basically, to try and think about how we can improve gardens. And yeah, it's important to think about the role of policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just before we get to Greg's question, there's a comment about a product, Clean Your AstroTurf, in the chat. And there's also a question about local planning authorities using design codes as a method to promote or force developers to incorporate biodiversity into private gardens. Surely BNG comes into this, small sites metric? Greg is nodding frantically, so maybe Greg would like to reply to this. Over to you, Greg.
Yeah, thanks. That's exactly what was one of the things on my mind. But before I just sort of talk about that, thanks very much for a really engaging talk. I really liked its structure. I think it got across a lot of points very, very succinctly. What I like is about it, I like talks like this, which give me this massive insecurity about tumbling the edifice of native species that we're all sort of like brought up on. And it's really interesting because it really does sort of get to a much broader philosophical point about our relationship with how we view the importance of native species. But on a practical note, and picking up what Debbie alluded to, I mean, I've been dipping my toe into biodiversity net gain, and I work mostly in urban areas, and see this sort of garden extension thing as a way of sort of gaining biodiversity. But of course, it's all that the hierarchy of native good, non-native bad is very firmly entrenched in the BNG metric. I mean, the only thing which it sort of coincides with what you're talking about, which I've always believed in, is the idea of ponds. But certainly when it comes to other bits of habitat, you've got very much that thrust, and yet quite clearly you've demonstrated with a phenomenal amount of space available, there's room for real gains in biodiversity. I'm just wondering, got any ideas on how we reconcile that?
Oh, dearie me. It's a bit late in the day for this, I think, Greg, but I'm not that familiar with BNG. And I guess how would that, I mean, the challenge I think is that we can, gardens are, they're changing hands, aren't they? So often there's, we can put the diversity potentially into the garden, but then it's ultimately up to the individual householder how that gets managed over time. So I guess, but I also agree that, the trouble is that too often we're just seeing gardens, they're just lawn, grass, that's it, and nothing else. And I think there'd be a lot of householders who would quite simply keep what they've already got and manage it that way. So it's so difficult just because this idea that how do we dictate what people do within their own garden is a big challenge when it comes to private land. I want just to be clear that I don't want to be too how do I say this? I agree with you that native plants are, of course, ideal, but I think gardens are unique habitats. They're sort of novel ecosystems, and so we can't be too stringent with that in certainly in gardens, and I think in urban ecosystems more generally. But I suppose it's a lot of the value that we're seeing from these sort of exotic plants often comes from some of the more generalist pollinators. So wild gardens are extremely good for wildlife, extremely good for pollinators. They don't support sort of specialist species often. They don't maybe support rare species, and it's fine. That I think that's but it's also I don't want to come across as sort of just simply saying that I'm advocating for non-natives. Mark, so just to be clear,
I'm going to draw that to a close and say we have just 3 minutes left.
Oh, sorry, I've been rambling.
And we have Annie wanting to make a comment, and we have a comment about BNG in the chat from Chris Harrison, which I'll ask you to read. Annie, could you very briefly make your point, please?
Hi guys, I'm Amy Cook from the Avon Wildlife Trust. I just wanted to chip in on that previous comment, but I won't open the box again, but maybe to lend a perspective from somebody who works more with community now. So I was formerly a consultant ecologist, and I've stepped into third sector work now. And something that I find so often with talking to people about taking action for nature in their personal green spaces is there's a huge resistance amongst more traditional gardeners about feeling with a lot of these myths that if they make their garden more wildlife friendly, they have to get rid of all of their beautiful bougainvilleas and jacaranda and whatever, and they have to have this big messy environment. And something that I'm finding from sort of a social perspective is actually compromising and finding a middle ground where you can within my role and the ecological advice that I give to individuals, I always start with promoting native species, but then if non-natives have come up, or if during the site visit I've seen that there's non-natives, we always try and incorporate that. And if people really love jasmine and really want to plant jasmine, then the compromise is to make sure that it's in a pot where it can be managed and it's away from fences that may lead into public parks or whatever this case may be. But I find that being able to provide sort of case-by-case, nuanced and context advice has been really fantastic across the Avon Wildlife Trust programme that we've been running for the last 2 years. And yeah, I found that it's actually been helpful in converting more traditionalists into being more open to considering native species. When you say, don't worry, we don't want you to cut down your magnolia, that's a fantastic early spring pollinator opportunity. So yeah, I just wanted to add my little 10 pence onto there.
Great example.
Okay.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah.
Well, very quickly, before we have to close this down, because we have another meeting starting at 7, I'd like to say thank you very much, Mark. That was a great presentation, thought-provoking for us all, I think. We probably need to have something on the native versus non-native, and actually considering what native actually means as another ASIG discussion event. Before you all go, I'd just like to remind you that next month, July, 3rd Thursday of the month, again, we have Phil from International Biodiversity Consultants talking about what it means to be an international ecologist working internationally. I'm hoping to get lots of students to that because it's to hear that point of view. Some of you might have come across Phil. He's been around a long time. He was with Jacobs, then he was with Ramboll. Loads of experience in EIAs, that kind of work. So that will be a very interesting talk. Of course, he's interested in recruiting. That's why he's doing it. He's got vacancies for various specialists. He's currently based in Indonesia, doing a lot of work in Asia and Africa. And the other thing I wanted to say was, if any of you are interested in apprenticeships, we have meetings next Thursday, the 27th. I've got one meeting for employers who might be interested in hearing about taking on an apprentice. And on the same day, we've also got a meeting for HEIs who might be interested in running an apprenticeship programme. And the reason for this is that we're in the consultation phase of revising the standard, the level 7, so it's MSc level ecologist standard, and all the endpoint assessment things that go with that. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for attending, and see some of you in the next meeting at 7.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you very much, guys.